Welcome to this Liberation Scotland UN update for March 2026. Today our guests are Alan McMahon, Craig Murray and Sara Salyers. By way of introduction, Sara, could you give us a short summary of what Liberation Scotland and Salvo are? There's a lot of people watching who have never maybe heard of it.
Okay, well, as briefly as I can, Liberation Scotland is the Scottish nationwide movement for exactly what it says on the can, for liberation. And that is to decolonize. That means decolonization. Liberation is decolonization. And there are two parts of the Liberation Scotland movement. There is Salvo, which is tackling decolonization on the ground at home, beginning to put together things like the Common Good Defenders, Claim of Right legal team, challenging the legitimacy of the state that calls itself the United Kingdom, and claims to have been created by a treaty in 1707, but does not recognize any of the conditions of its creation, conditions precedent or conditions continuing. So if there was such a state as the UK, and we know actually that it's a fiction, but if there were, and if it had been created by a treaty, there are certain rights and obligations that Scots are entitled to. And actually they include the sovereignty of the people, which means the right to tell Westminster to get the heck out. So on the one hand, that's what Salvo is doing at home, but also working along with the Liberation Scotland Committee, which is the other part of Scotland's liberation movement, to obtain recognition that Scotland is, in fact, a colony, whether people like that or not, whether they cringe, and that's usually because they don't understand what a colony is, or, how it operates. As the latest Scottish Parliament document on routes to independence shamefully shows, they have no idea what that is or means. And the reason for that is really very simple. The English state, calling itself the UK, has Scotland by the throat by saying you won't get international recognition unless you negotiate with Westminster for permission to declare independence or to have a referendum, or as the Supreme Court recently showed, to have an opinion poll on whether people want another referendum. And they are right in one respect, that so long as the lie that a state was created in 1707 voluntarily by two parties, if Scotland were to declare independence unilaterally while the world believes the lie, we would not be recognised. We'd be in a kind of limbo. Our independence would be contested. We'd be like Kosovo. So what Liberation Scotland is doing internationally through the Liberation Scotland Committee is working to really just to bust that lie, to show that it is a lie, to get international recognition, that Scotland was annexed by England, that it is a state in waiting, that the UK is a big fat fiction running around England, naked under the butcher's apron, pretending to be something that it's not, while Scotland limps along its colony, which it pretends is its kidnapped victim, which it pretends is its voluntary partner in this. So those two sides, what it does, what getting recognition does internationally is it clears the obstacle. That's all it does. It clears the roadblock. It means that Scotland is freed up. It's acknowledged internationally that it has the right to a free and fair expression, which is self-determination without interference or let alone permission by Westminster. And that's when the doors are open, and then we can look at how we organize to express the desire to get the hell out of this toxic thing, the union.
Okay, so Salvo is the domestic arm, Liberation Scotland Committee is the overseas.
Yeah.
International.
Yeah.
Thank you. Craig, you had your hand up.
No.
Okay, Alan, how many trips have been made to the UN so far by Liberation Scotland Committee?
Well, that's 4, Peter. We first went to New York. Craig and our representatives, JPTI at the time, went to New York, and that was June last year, to what's called the C24 conference. And and they spoke there on behalf of 2 non-self-governing territories, of which there are 17, and that is what we're aiming to achieve, that status given to us by the United Nations. So they spoke about New Caledonia. Craig spoke about New Caledonia, and the JPTI representative spoke about French Polynesia. So that was last June in New York City, the New York HQ. And then in September, we held at what's called the UNOG, UN Office Geneva, which deals principally with human rights issues. We held a conference, a fringe event inside the Palais des Nations itself, which was very well attended. We had, I think, 6 speakers. I think we had, and we had a couple by remote as well. We had Professor Robert Black, a very distinguished Scottish law jurist, and we had a chap called George Katrougalis, who is a UN special rapporteur. And it was very well attended. It was attended by the BBC actually, but they didn't actually report. And we had this quite a strong impression that they thought they were coming along to see an empty room, and thought the better of it when they discovered that there were actually people standing in the room as well as sitting around a rather large table. So that was in September, and that went enormously well. And we made some great contacts there where people came along from the African Union and a whole variety of other entities seeking independence. And then we had another event in October in New York, which Craig attended with Professor Al Baird, and both spoke again with JPTI. All 3 spoke again in support of certain colonized nations, non-self-governing territories, including the former 2 that I mentioned, New Caledonia, French Polynesia, and Western Sahara. And this is very important because this gives us support from these nations. It's hugely important that we have this external support. And then finally, Sara and I went to Geneva just last week for what's called the Human Rights Council 61, quite an extensive event. And again, we held an external fringe event there in the John Knox International Centre with the title of The Price of Empty Rhetoric. And you might ask, well, people have asked, well, why are you getting involved in empty rhetoric? What is your concern? Well, the business of the UN is up in the air, and there are huge changes afoot worldwide. I'm sure we'll speak more about it, but it's very important that we engage in that. So that's the 4th of our attendances, and each time we extend our reach, we extend our contacts, we find people with like-minded people who share our interest and who sympathise. It seems to be very easy to find sympathy for our cause amongst the decolonised peoples of the world in particular. So there we are, Peter. That's 4 events so far.
Well, excellent. Craig, can I ask you about the UN itself and its effectiveness? Looking at world events, some people may question just how effective the UN is at the moment. How's it going to help Scotland in the current situation?
Yeah. Well, of course, it depends on what you want the UN to do. It's never been effective in the sense of being able to impose its will or its rules on countries. The UN doesn't have armed forces. It doesn't have the ability to physically intervene. If it wants to intervene, if the international community wants to intervene in a conflict, then it has to do so through the Security Council with a Chapter 7 resolution. And the problem is that the UN is essentially a collection of member states. It has its own institutional existence. It has institutions which are part of it. It has its secretariat. It has UNESCO. It has the International Court of Justice. It has various other institutions. But at heart, it's a collection of member states, and it can only act when the member states wish to act. And when the member states are split, then it can do very little. And that's why it is so impotent in the current crisis in the Middle East, for example. because on West Asia there is no unanimity, and the major members of the Security Council, some member states are themselves the ones committing the crimes. And in a situation like that, I can understand people worry about the impotence of the United Nations. But where the United Nations is not impotent, and where it's extremely important from Scotland's point of view, is the fact it is a collection of member states. And we want to be a member of state. We want to be a part of it. We want to take our place. We want to have the Saltire flying outside those UN headquarters buildings in Geneva and in New York. And then, as Sarah says, until you see your Saltire flying in New York and in Geneva, you're not really a state. A state is an entity which exists in relation to other states. That's what a state is. Becoming a state is not at all a matter of domestic law. And this is where this recent parliamentary report that Sarah referred to by the Scottish Parliament gets it completely wrong, because it approaches the question as entirely a question of domestic law, of domestic UK law, whereas being a state is nothing to do with domestic law at all. Being a state is a matter of international law. You are a state if you are recognised by other states. If other states recognise Scotland as a state, Scotland is a state, irrespective of what the domestic law of the UK says. And if the United Nations doesn't recognise Scotland as a state, Scotland is not a state, no matter what the domestic law of Scotland says. It is the existence of a state is confirmed in its relationship to other states, and you earn that acceptance, and it has to be won and formalised through the United Nations, and that's what we are setting out to do. And the advantage of the Committee of 24 and General Assembly procedure, which is the procedural means, we're working on many fronts. We are we're at the most important formative contact-making stage in getting the international community to understand Scotland's case, understand Scotland exists, understand Scotland is a state, is a nation that should be a state. And that's an area where, I don't want to digress too much, but that's an area where, as Alan referred to, there's enormous sympathy. We are absolutely pushing at an open door with the large majority of the international community. But also, we have to go through the various legal avenues available, and the primary one of those is to go through the Committee of 24 to the General Assembly and get the General Assembly to accept Scotland's colonial status, because that removes the ability of the Security Council to veto your recognition at the end of the process. So we are working. That's not the only avenue, and there are other avenues, other procedural avenues also to be pursued, and other legal avenues in international law also to be pursued. And Sarah and Alan had very useful and interesting initiated discussions on those in their recent trip in Geneva. But that gives, if you like, an overview, if you like, of why the United Nations. And I want to add one thing, which is that Scotland has its parliament, it has its so-called government, and that so-called government is supposedly committed to independence. And yet they have done none of these things that Sarah and Alan and Alf and I and others have been trying to do for years and years and years, with all the resources of a budget in the tens of billions of pounds behind them. We have achieved more on the international scene than the government of Scotland has achieved in decades of supposed independent supporters being in power. And we have done it for a few £1,000s of cash donations from from the wonderful members of Salvo and Liberation. And we've done it just ourselves with the tremendous work put in by the committees of those organisations. But I really do think people need to understand that genuine progress is being made here. We have states which are as states now, becoming sympathetic to the idea of Scottish independence, which 2 years ago hadn't heard of the notion of Scottish independence, didn't realise it was on the international agenda. And I think the achievements of Salvo and Liberation are actually astonishing, bluntly. And I've always warned, and this is why I get told off for being too dour, but I've always warned it is a slow process. It's not a sprint. It takes time. But the progress is better than I would have thought at this stage.
Okay, thanks, Craig. Sarah, how does the UN actually work? What's it like to be there? I know this is something you want to try and get across to members of Liberation and Salvo.
Well, of course, you'll need to ask Craig about New York, because I don't have firsthand experience of that, but he had a very good experience, at least in June last year. But what was interesting this time about Geneva? So I've been to Geneva twice now, and Craig's right. There are areas that we now are aware of as being so. One is that it's very useful. We're aware of fertile areas for pushing forward, things that we can do on the ground here in Scotland, bringing in special rapporteurs on the basis of the rights that Scots have, even if they were not, even if you leave external self-determination, independence, liberation to one side, Scots have rights as a distinct people and a distinct nation, none of which have been honoured by the colonising power. And colonising powers don't actually tend to, but England is worse than most. And those rights are things that, again, echoing Craig, our own administration, because they're not really a government, they're Westminster in Scotland to be accurate, but our own administration, who claim to be, all the out for Scotland and making things better for Scotland and all of the rest of it, have done nothing about it. They've done nothing about challenging the human rights that are being denied Scots, the right to the media that represents our own identity, the rights to our languages, the right to cultural expression, the right to our history to be taught in our schools, the right to having Scots, literature and culture on the curriculum in schools, the right to Scots in Scots universities, Scots teaching in Scots universities, and so on. And much and more. They've done nothing about that. And that paints a picture. It's really, really important. When you can actually present that, and you can have that set before the Human Rights Council and acknowledged, that paints a picture that is very clear to the rest of the world, as well as hopefully getting Scots up off the floor and fighting for their rights. So that's a thing we're learning now. But the other thing about being there was, as we know, the world is in real upheaval at the moment. And it was really interesting to see the difference in just in 6 months between the tone. There's a sort of protocol within the United Nations. So, for example, if you're in the main hall, the assembly hall of the Human Rights Council session, or any session, actually, main session, you do not clap, you do not shout, you do not stand up and speak, and whether even if somebody is saying something absolutely appalling, and you speak in a very, there's a diplomatic language, so that last year, somebody says something about hypocrisy, that it's hypocrisy not to follow certain things, and that's really quite strong. This year, there were all kinds of actual side events and fringe events about the we did ours on the empty rhetoric, the price of empty rhetoric, and that was based on this picking up what was going on at the UN, and kind of pulsing all the way through it. Very, very different. That the world is paying the price for the fact that the United Nations did as Mark Carney said, and applied double standards, and did not follow its own charter, and allowed the rules to be applied differently to some countries, to some states than they were to others. And so I said, Scotland was ignored and other countries were ignored, and impunity has led, that kind of impunity that has led to this. It became rhetoric instead of the international law. And so that was really it was fierce. But the fiercest was a Hong Kong, young Hong Kong legislator called Dominic Lee, who went for it. I don't know if you've got that link, but he tore into the West, into the UK particularly, and the US, for their utter hypocrisy when they call out other states on human rights violations when their own are so egregious. And it felt historic to be sitting in the chamber when he made, and it was only about 2 minutes, when he made this absolutely impassioned takedown of the US and the UK, and you could feel the shock.
When Hong Kong's national security law was enacted in 2020, Western countries condemned us, they sanctioned us, they call it a violation to human rights. But here's what I want to say. Since enacting this law, Hong Kong's economy has recovered, tourism has flourished, the people finally feel safe again. And what's more important is that I really want to ask, what moral authority does the United States, a country that's ruled by the Epsteins, have over my country, a country that has lifted over 800 million people out of poverty? What moral authority does Britain, a country that arrested over 12,000 of its own people for posting online, have to lecture us about civil liberties? And what moral authority do NATO countries that preach human rights in this very chamber, while turning a blind eye on the Zionist genocide in Gaza, have to tell us what justice looks like? We will not be silenced by nations that treat human rights as bargaining chips, a tool of foreign policy. We will not accept lectures from governments that use human rights as weapons while their own hands are stained with the blood of Palestinians and Iranians they choose to forget. And we will not rest until every nation in this chamber is held to the same standard, until hypocrisy crumbles, genocide is met with action, and peace is no longer a word we speak, but a world we build. Thank you, Mr. President.
And no, people haven't seen this, at least, not in a long time. So you can feel this happening. And I thought, one thing I thought was, it's really good to be here, to be where all of this is right in front of you. It's all playing out, and that you can come back and tell people back home about it, so that they don't have to feel as if they're sitting on the bleachers while other people play the game.
Was that the point where you actually wanted to applaud and...
I almost did. I had to sit on my hands, or I would have applauded and been thrown out.
Craig and Alan, how significant are people of the caliber of Robert Black, KC, joining the liberation cause? You mentioned him earlier, but just how important is that?
I think it's extremely important. We face domestic opposition, and we face obvious domestic opposition from unionists. And we face domestic opposition from so-called independent supporters who are working within institutions which are part of the British state, and particularly all the institutions of the Scottish government. And there's this very large dependency mechanism in Scotland, whereby there are also it's not just a question of the Scottish government and its ministers and its special advisors and those people. The Scottish government funds an extraordinarily inflated third sector of NGOs and various groups which are purportedly delivering various services on behalf of the Scottish government, but actually become an echo chamber for it. And a lot of these people have a vested interest in the current setup, see us as a threat, and they don't like the fact that we are achieving things and doing things that the Scottish government doesn't do, and that they have no presence at the United Nations, have made no attempt whatsoever to forward the case of Scottish independence with other countries. And universally, they say that we are cranks and eccentrics and crazy people and have no idea what we are talking about, and that I don't know anything about domestic law, even though, they say I know nothing about international law, even though I was a British ambassador and a member of the senior management structure of the Foreign Office for 6 years, and have represented the UK at United Nations meetings. They claim I don't know what I'm doing. It's extremely difficult for them when you have people of the caliber of Robert Black, who is undoubtedly the single most important living authority on Scots law, saying that we are right on the legal question and we are right on the Treaty of Union and its non-applicability, setting out the arguments very cogently and in proper reasoned articles for Scottish independence and its legal establishment.
For more than 60 years, for 59 of those years, I have believed implicitly, and in my career I have encouraged others to believe, that as a result of the Treaty of Union, the Acts of Union, the Scottish and English parliaments ceased to exist. That effectively, as states in international law, Scotland and England ceased to exist and were superseded by a new entity, the United Kingdom of Great Britain. Now that, I may say, was not the view of the early 18th century. Early 18th century scholars, politicians, as to what had happened in 1707. That became the standard orthodox view really only in the 19th century. To look as a lawyer with fresh eyes at what actually happened in 1707 and thereabouts, I am now convinced that this explanation of what actually happened in 1707 is false. The events of 1707 certainly resulted in Scotland's Parliament and executive government ceasing to exist. But was there any parallel in England? Were the governmental institutions of both nations replaced by institutions of a new state? The answer, of course, is no. And what I want to do is to look at the institutions of government. Now, the first branch of government I want to look at is the legislative branch. Now, after 1707, both houses of the English Parliament remained in being exactly the same as before, save for the addition to the House of Commons of 45 Scots selected by the outgoing Scottish Parliament and 12 peers selected by the peers of Scotland. The incumbent officers and members of the Parliament of England remained exactly as before. And they, of course, were the overwhelming majority in that new body. Not even a general election was held to mark this supposedly new institution. So, what happened? Well, for Scotland, everything changed. We lost our legislature. But for England, nothing changed. Now, they didn't even elect a new speaker. The speaker before the Scots joined remained the speaker after the Scots joined. Now, the speaker in question was one John Smith, MP for Andover. Now, Those of you who remember him or know of him at all probably remember him for one thing. And that one thing is that he said, "We have catched Scotland and will bind her fast."
It's very difficult for them and it's important to us, if you like, because frankly they have nothing. They have nothing but insult to hurl at us. Or they just go straight for the ad hominem. It's the only argument that they have. Oh, don't listen to him, he's mad. Don't listen to her, she's nuts. Oh, no, 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 it's all nonsense. It's all, it's not worth doing. They're wasting your time. It's not worth bothering. Of course, we are right to do nothing. That's a basic argument. We are right to do nothing. And you'll forgive me. I actually get very, very fed up with his argument by people who are doing nothing and whose advice is, well, nothing can be done. There's nothing we can do. Nothing can be done. Nothing can be done about Scottish independence. Of course, we would like it, but in fact, it's practically impossible. We can't really do anything. Our hands are tied. We're just going to keep taking our salaries. The people who make that argument are people I really don't have much time for at all, because a very great deal can be done, and we are doing it. And Robert Black's support and people of his caliber, and we have people of tremendous caliber. We really are extremely fortunate in the people we have doing this work.
Thanks, Craig. Alan, on a similar theme, we have friends and allies, I take it, by this time, or is that hoping for too much?
Well, I'll just say something a little bit more, if you don't mind, about
Sure.
about the legal side of things. I think I agree, of course, with Craig. It's just enormously important to have somebody of the caliber of Robert Black supporting our case very, very cogently, very, very strongly. And I think that's particularly important when you consider that some lawyers, distinguished lawyers in the past, people like David Walker, for instance, Professor David Walker, who was very, very sympathetic towards Scottish independence, kind of got there, but never quite went the full way. I mean, David Walker would consider the violations of that all that was required was to fix the violations of the Treaty of Union, but never really getting to the heart of the matter. The Treaty of Union was invalid from the very word go. It never came into effect. It was never brought into effect. It was never intended to come into effect. Instead of that, it was substituted by annexation. And this is what Robert Black very, very clearly points out. And very interestingly, what Robert Black has to say is practically identical to what the British government's jurists, Crawford and Boyle, said in 2012. That England identically continued right through the Treaty of Union. So that's important. Even people like, maybe closer to us, Neil McCormick. Neil McCormick never quite got there as well. He never really took the final step. The thing that actually makes everything understandable, all the contradictions that occur in the British Constitution suddenly become understandable when you see that this is an annexation. So this is hugely important, and we need to add to that, and I think we can add to that. As Sara will tell you, we met. We've been speaking to distinguished lawyers at Geneva. And we think we can bolster we can add to what Professor Black's had to say. One particular individual is a historian. He's written very, very, very famous book in post-World War II book. So I think we can add very, very strongly to that. And it's hugely important that we have that kind of gravitas to back the case that actually Sara has formulated. And of course, this is a case that's been formulated outside of the legal profession itself. Sometimes that's what it takes, because it's very difficult to change something, a huge juggernaut, to turn it around, which is what's required of the Scottish legal profession, Scots law actually. You asked me something else, Peter, and I forgot what it was.
Asked about friends and allies. Are we creating friends and allies? That's a question for everybody, really.
Yeah, I think that maybe Sara will answer that. Certainly so, but I'm sure Sara will tell you more.
One of the things that Alan raised was we were talking to some the lawyers. Well, lawyers a poor word really for what either of them are. But and I don't. We're not. So sorry, this is another bit for cutting out. I don't want to use the names, but
No, it's okay. We'll just let's speak more generally about that.
okay. So
we're not looking for. We don't want to make anyone a target, if you know what I mean.
that's my thought. So, but in terms of support, what we are seeing is each time that we send an embassy, we have an outreach like this, we improve what we know, we improve our contacts, we improve alliances. Very interestingly, we had one of the attendees in September was at our Fringe event was a representative from the African Union, and we bumped into him and his group just in the concourse at the Palais des Nations in Geneva, and sat down and got talking, and he was very enthusiastic about inviting us to come out at and be put up by them and talk more with them and extend our relationship there. And it was clearly in sincere, and I think we'll probably do that.
In that respect, has BRICS entered into this equation anywhere?
I would not sort of not in a yes, but not in a conscious way. I mean, it's not BRICS, but we've had interaction with BRICS members,
Yeah.
and I think overall talking about so I can say we do this. This is groundwork, but we're creating these relationships and awareness of Scotland's situation, and also extending what's possible, what we can do, to kind of increase momentum at the same time. And one thing I do think, and I'm going to then hand over to Craig, one thing I do think it's really important for people to understand, crucially important for people to understand, particularly those who have a tendency to say, look, you get on with dealing with Scotland's independence and stop bothering about, things that are happening in other parts of the world. And this is none of our business. And what's happened? Why are you going on about Palestine? This has nothing to do with us. It's nothing to do with Scotland. Or Venezuela, nothing to do with Scotland. And actually, Craig is joining us from Caracas in Venezuela today. So why are we bothering? Well, it goes like this, guys and girls. As Craig pointed out very clearly, Scotland's future depends, as an independent state, depends entirely on its relationship with other states. Scotland's recognition as a sovereign state is what makes Scotland a sovereign, independent state. And without friends, that won't happen. And without friends, we won't get through the C24 process. We won't get a vote in our favor at the General Assembly. So if you cared nothing about any other moral or ethical issue, if you thought colonialism was just fine except for Scotland, it would still be very foolish to suggest that Scotland should not be standing alongside other nations that have been colonized or are facing colonization or are trying to stand against colonization and colonialism right now, because those are our allies, those are our friends. The colonialists are not. And what kind of friends are we if we are silent when we see other peoples facing the horrors that sit in our history today? The genocide. And Scotland did have a genocide. It was covered up. And it was as horrible as any genocide you've ever heard of. And very upsetting to find out about, let me tell you. And we have had ethnic cleansing and population displacement and deliberate poverty and being denied everything that makes us Scots, like every other colony. So when we see it elsewhere, we'd be utter hypocrites not to stand against it, not to raise our voices against it, not to form relationships of solidarity with those who are also standing against it. But even in our own self-interest, it would be the kind of stupid you don't recover from to fail to take that stand. And I think in terms of support and solidarity and the sense of, collegiality and so on that is developing, and that we're developing for Scotland. I think Craig's probably best to speak about that.
Okay. Over to you, Craig. Any thoughts
I
on
think
this?
that was a very, very important point. So you don't get decolonized without being part of the anti-colonial movement, basically. And the warmth that we have found from others, both others who have been decolonized themselves in our former colonies, and from those still struggling to gain their independence in other colonies. The warmth and understanding that we have found from those countries has been enormous. And those are the countries who really matter at the United Nations. There was a vote at the United Nations during the last week on a motion put forward by Ghana, actually by John Mahama, the president of Ghana, who's a personal friend of mine, who spoke on the motion at the General Assembly in New York, a motion condemning the transatlantic slave trade. And that motion passed by 129 votes for to 3 against. And the 3 against were Israel, the United States, and Argentina, who voted against condemning the transatlantic slave trade. The United Kingdom abstained, as did all the European Union countries, and they abstained because they said they condemned the transatlantic slave trade, but did not believe that there should be any reparations paid, if you like. But that motion passed by 129 votes to 3. Of 129 states who voted for that motion are exactly the states we want to vote for Scottish independence. And that vote for Scottish independence at the United Nations will get us independence. And they are basically the global south, as it's called, or we used to refer to developing nations. In the United Nations, they used to be called the G77, because there used to be 77 of them. And funnily enough, they're still normally known as that group name there. But the people we are working with, who are the majority at the UN and the majority in the UN General Assembly, and it is the General Assembly which counts here, are the developing nation states. And I mean, one thing I've said before to people from Liberation and Salvo, but one thing I want to make plain, and I don't know whether Alan and Sarah would also say this, but to my surprise, I have never had anyone from any developing nation, from any former colony or from any other state which is still colonized, nobody from the global south has turned around to me once and said, but you Scots were colonizers. That point has never been made. And yet it's the point which Scots make against themselves. And of course there were members of the Scots elite who were complicit in the slave trade, who were complicit in colonialism, who were co-opted, because colonized nations always had their elites co-opted, just as there were Indians who were complicit in helping govern India under the Raj, and the vast majority of the soldiers who actually physically conquered India for the Raj were Indian soldiers recruited by the East India Company. This idea that because once you are a colony, you are, of course, co-opted and part of the empire. The idea that makes you not a colony is utter nonsense. It's almost not worth considering. And yet, and it is a point, as I say, which nobody thinks that's a point in among the countries whose support we need internationally. And yet it's a point so frequent. It's the most frequent point made against us by those in Scotland who don't like our approach.
Alan, did you want to come in there?
Yeah, yes, interesting. The other day, I saw something very interesting. It was an interview with a Maltese diplomat, I don't know if you know him, Craig, by the name of Everest Bartolo. And he happened to, in the course of the discussion, happened to mention about the Chinese. He said the Chinese also, sought out. They crossed the ocean in their boats and went to foreign places in pursuit of trade. But he said they never went with an army. They went to establish trading colonies. He didn't call them colonies. We Scots used to call them colonies, meaning that they were remote, a bit like the colonies in Edinburgh. They're called the colonies, the housing in Edinburgh, because at that time they weren't next to the Royal Botanic Gardens. They were in the middle of nowhere, if you like, in the middle of fields outside of Edinburgh. So it just made a remote place. But the Chinese went abroad in their boats, and they were seeking trade, never with an army. Now, he just had to mention that in the passing, but it occurred to me that actually one of the accusations that come at us very regularly is that, oh, you Scots, we Scots even, sought a colony in Darien in Panama, under the Darien scheme. Well, what was being sought was a trading colony, as I say, an establishment that it was there for the purpose of trade, not as a plantation with all the normal stuff associated with that, slavery and the rest. And there was no Scots slave trade before 1707. And of course, as Craig's rightly pointed out, if you're a colony, you've got no agency any longer as a state, as a nation. Of course, individuals have got agency, and that can be seen in the number of those co-opted in Scotland who took part in the colonies, whether as running plantations, or in the case of, I come from Badgate, and there's a well-known chap who established the Badgate Academy called John Newland, who ran what they call pens with animals feeding the colonizers. Anyway, Scots as individuals had no agency. Individuals did have agency, and of course you can see country mansions all around Scotland, which are associated with colonisation, with individuals who they made their money out of that. Paxton House is one, for instance, in the Borders. But it's something that needs to be tackled, and we're constantly, we criticize ourselves for the business of partaking in it, and it's something that needs to be addressed, actually, how it occurred and how it always occurs in a colony that people are co-opted to do the colonizers' bidding. It's part and parcel of the process of colonization. Use the last colony you made, use them to project your colonization, your imperialism even further.
Listen, Alan, Craig, and Sarah, thanks so much. So interesting. And Sarah, could you just tell us a little bit about a crowdfunder? You mentioned a crowdfunder to me.
Well, yes, we're getting ready to launch this year's crowdfunder. Basically, because things are now gearing up, as you might have gathered from this conversation, and we're getting ready to send out, I guess, diplomatic missions across the world to begin putting in place the support that we're going to need. We're hoping to go to the C24 seminar, which takes place in Managua this year, and to talk to members one-to-one. And we will need a good few people there, because it's only a few days, and you do get a chance to sit down with, and talk personally to the representatives who make up the Committee of 24. And so we'd like to make sure there are a number of us who can cover all 24. Actually, it's more than 24. It's a lot more than 24 now. Craig will tell you how many. And there are various other events. As I said, we're hoping to bring over at least one special rapporteur to look into the situation in Scotland in terms of human rights. One
That
of
will be at the conference.
Well, we're also hoping to get this conference underway, either with the SSRG, or if that's going to take too long, do one of our own, a shorter one. But yes, we'd like to have some of the people to come over and speak to people in Scotland, so that they can hear from the horse's mouth, as it were.
Yeah.
How Scotland is being seen on the world stage now.
Yeah.
And all of that. As Craig said, we don't have all that money that the Scottish administration for Westminster and Holyrood has behind it. And so we've got to raise that money from people who are already struggling. We're very, very aware of that. I'll say again, we don't take salaries, any of us.
It's on the lines that it's a people's movement.
It's absolutely a people's movement, and we're very, very conscious of how the money we raise is used, and that it has to be, we have to get the most out of it that we possibly can. And if we could do this, we've been doing it really very cheaply and with a lot of generosity from members and supporters. We're going to have to up that, what we ask now. But as Craig said, it's easy to get frustrated and say, well, okay, well, how long is this going to take? But we've done what we've done in a year. We started this just a little over a year ago, and we are here in a year. And if you think we're really kind of upping the ante now, and the way things are in the world, they turn on a dime. So it would be absolutely heartbreaking if the opportunity for Scotland to be recognised, for the truth to come out and be recognised across the world. The state calling itself the United Kingdom is England by another name. It used a treaty to pretend it was going to create this new state, which it pretends was created to this day, and instead it dismantled the Scottish state and continued without alteration, giving the lie to the two former kingdoms were extinguished, etc., etc. It was just England. And when that is made known and people understand, and let me tell you, Craig is quite right, because people will say, when you talk to them about Scotland's situation and you talk to representatives abroad, they say, oh, yes, we know. Well, that's funny because most Scots don't, but they do. And we hear that all the time. Oh, yes, we know. And then you talk, but didn't you? Then the thing they get hung up on is the referendum. But didn't you have a referendum? And so when you say, well, yes, we did, but it had a local council franchise. People who didn't live in Scotland were allowed to vote in it. People who had holiday homes in Scotland were allowed to vote. Military personnel who were just temporarily there got to vote. You list all of that, and the way that there were no international observers. It wasn't a constitutional referendum. It wasn't binding. They broke the rules. They allowed a media that was 70% one way, in favor of no.
Right, yeah.
And they offered a huge incentive for people in Scotland not to vote yes at the last minute. And they say, oh, but everybody needs to know that. That's what we're told, that we need to let the international community know. Not that Scotland is a colony, because they kind of know. I don't think they realise that actually, the UK is a fiction, and and that Scotland should have been recognised by now. But that's not a difficult leap for them. The thing that people kind of catch their breath on is that we didn't really have the kind of referendum that means that we have being given the right to an exercise in self-determination. So, and that's interesting that's the thing that people kind of catch on. And anyway, yes, so the crowdfunder is, we want to do this as quickly as it can be done. And that's going to take hands to the pump, and it's going to take investment. It's going to take the money that it costs to get out there and get things moving.
Part of the evidence of our effectiveness is that the colonial states, who we always expected would move against us, have come in and bought out our partner by paying them more, basically. The partner we were originally working with, JPTI, were moved against, or the states moved against us, and because they wanted to hinder our effectiveness, and JPTI, in fact, were offered more money and in order to represent a colonial power instead of working for Scotland.
So they were actually got at. Alan, Craig, and Sarah, thanks so much for your thoughts and taking the time. All the best with your activities in Venezuela, Craig, and please stay safe. And we'll speak again.
Do my best. I've got to come back. I'm standing for election. It's a strange place to run an election campaign for.
Just remind us where you're standing, Craig. A little plug.
Good man. I'm standing in Edinburgh central for the Alliance to Liberate Scotland.
And who are you up against?
Angus Robertson, that's who is. It's actually against the law to abuse an election candidate, strangely. So I'm not going to call him MI5's man in Scotland.
No, I wouldn't want to
Or
call him
our
MI5
Zionists either.
in Scotland.
Or Zionists. Not going to mention any of those things.
No, we shouldn't. No, and we won't. Thanks very much, folks, and we'll speak again soon.
Thank you, Peter.
Thank you.
Bye, Peter.
Bye-bye.